from here going forward, because we're going to spend the bulk of our time in the text and going between the text and our notes, okay? And so the need for the iPad goes down. Your distractibility goes down when the iPad's not in front of you. And our reading comprehension goes up when we look at the paper text, okay? Good? Because pretty much from now until the end of the school year, we're going to live in the texts of the New Testament. All right. So here's the goal for today. I'm going to give you some introductory material to the Gospel of Matthew. Author, audience, date, purpose. This is a common set of information you're going to see every time we start a new text in the New Testament. We're going to talk about who the author was, and we're going to talk about some background of the book. And we're going to talk about some big picture thematic issues and things we need to pay attention to. And then we're going to start in on some brief material in Matthew's Gospel to get us started, okay, on key ideas right off the bat in the Gospel of Matthew. My goal is to only take about half your time and then turn that time over to you to be working on your exam. You can go ahead and go. I half forgot that it was there. Okay, does that make sense, guys? You with me so far? Okay. So we're going to start with this in our notes. The title, Matthew, is actually a shorthand because the book's title is actually the Gospel according to Matthew. Okay? Or if you're a little bit more liturgical and traditional in your church format, then it's, quote, the Gospel according to Saint Matthew, right? Depending on your church background. So the Gospel according to Matthew. Was written by Ballard. Was written by Matthew, the disciple or the apostle, who we see in the gospel is also called Levi when Jesus meets him for the first time. And this individual, Levi, when we meet him the first time, is a tax collector. Which is not a good thing to be in the first century Jewish world. So the Romans would enact taxes, okay, because every empire had taxes. However, they would use local individuals to collect that tax. Okay, so Hamilton's our tax collector. Sorry, dude. It's about to get really bad for you, by the way. Well, really good and really bad for him, like simultaneously. So the Romans would tell him it's a 10% tax, right? But then he would charge 15.
Dirty pig.
10? Because, well, hang on. I mean, the Romans aren't paying him. That's the deal here. He's not getting a salary from the Roman Empire for collecting taxes. So he's actually going to set his own salary by setting a tax percentage. So the base percent is 10 because that's what has to go to Rome, yeah? But the extra 5 you keep. Rome doesn't care how much you add to it so long as they get their 10. Make sense? So typically what happens is groups of tax collectors sort of agree on the going rate. Because if you set it at 15 and I come along and set it at 12, you're going to be unemployed really fast. Because everybody's going to come to me because it's 12, right? But if he sets it at 15 and I set it at 20, then I'm unemployed. So we got to find a middle ground. So what happens is we set it, and when we get greedy, we raise it. Or when Rome raises it, we raise it to keep our profit margins equal. Here's what that means. We are individuals who belong to the community that's being taxed. But we are extorting from you what is not necessarily fair. Does that make sense? That doesn't mean that every tax collector is doing that, but it means that's the tendency of tax collectors in the first century. You with me on that? Okay. An individual like Zacchaeus, then. Easy little man. Remember that guy? Okay. He's a tax collector. And he says, if I've defrauded anybody, I'll pay them back 7 times. That means one of two things. Either he's defrauded people and reinvested that money so much that he's got enough wealth that he can pay you back 7 times what he owes you, which is substantial, by the way. Or he's been an honest tax collector. And he's taken what was necessary, but not what would be considered extortion. Are you following me on that? Levi is a tax collector. Peter, James, and John are fishermen. Matthew is a tax collector. Jesus is not necessarily gathering Harvard elites or popular individuals. Jesus grabbed a tax collector to follow him, not another rabbi, not members of rabbinic schools of thought. He's gathering individuals who, quote, don't have any business doing this. Are you following me on this? Okay. So that's our first consideration. Second, our audience. By all accounts, this is probably written to Palestinian Jews or Palestinian Jewish Christians. Matthew does not explain any of the sort of Jewish isms in his gospel. He doesn't explain holy days. He doesn't explain certain Jewish customs and practices. Jesus says things that sound rather distinctly Jewish. Like he doesn't say the kingdom of God in Matthew. He says the kingdom of heaven. And any self-respecting, covenant-following Jew in the first century would not make reference to God directly so that they didn't violate the commandment to take the name of God in vain. They would have made reference to heaven instead. So you would have prayed like, our Father in heaven, instead of God, our Father. Does that make sense? Because you don't say the word God, you say our Father in heaven. And you would have said the kingdom of heaven instead of the kingdom of God because you don't make reference to God directly out of reverence or respect. Tracking with me on that? Those things feature in Matthew's gospel. In addition to that, Matthew doesn't explain Jewish customs because he doesn't have to. He's writing to a Jewish audience. Where other gospels like Luke's and Mark's explain Jewish practices or customs because they're writing to Gentiles, or at least Gentiles are included in the audience. Helpful? Okay. Date. Let's do it this way. When would you think Matthew would have written his gospel? First. Besides, give me a year. Let's do it this way. Jesus is born in 6, for the sake of argument and the sake of this class. Jesus is born sometime around the year 6 BC. So if he's 33 when he's crucified, that means AD 27. Okay. So when would Matthew be writing his gospel? 30. So you're talking about within 3 years, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Because he was he followed Jesus
Sure.
for a while.
Yep.
His entire ministry.
Yep.
And so if you're that impacted by the gospel, I guess, then you're more the quicker you would be to understand it and write about it.
Okay. Somebody else? How many of you agree? Sometime around the year 30? Okay. Probably not. It's not earlier than that, by the way. It's probably closer to 50 than it is to 30. It's probably more like 20 or 25 years after the death and resurrection and the ascension, okay, than it is 3 or 4 years. Because remember, there are two competing factors here. We're talking Palestinian Jews, so the Jewish culture is orally based, right? It's a spoken culture, not a written culture. So part of that is that. The other part of it is there's not a need as long as all the apostles are around. We don't need to write it down. We're all here. But as we start to approach things, they get more and more persecution oriented toward Christians. Now we need to write this stuff down. Because as persecution ramps up, well, we could die tomorrow, so let's write this stuff down. Yeah? That's a real historic catalyst for the writing of these texts. So, sometime between 50 and 60. Here's the deal. If Mark is first, you're going to push Matthew back. Right? So if you think Mark wrote first and you follow that document stuff, then Mark is first, early 50s, maybe late 40s, which that might be way early though. Okay? Just historic considerations we'll have to take into account with Mark because he's got to be connected to Peter and in Rome most likely. So we're still looking at like the early to mid 50s for Mark, which means Matthew's probably late 50s. So if you're a document hypothesis person, the most accepted date is somewhere around 58. Okay? If you're somebody like me who buys what St. Augustine had to tell us, that Matthew wrote his gospel first, we're working on an oral tradition, and if you think he wrote like a Hebrew version of it, and then this is a translation into Greek, then composition can be a lot earlier. A lot earlier in this case is a swing of about 6 years. So if Mark is first, Matthew's probably somewhere around 58. If Matthew's first, somewhere in the range around the early to mid, like 52 to 54. Okay? You with me? I'm more inclined to go like this early in the 50s. We're still talking about 25 years after Jesus. Okay? Are you tracking here? I'm more inclined somewhere around 52 or 53. In part because that oral tradition material we talked about. I'm also inclined that way because I think Matthew's gospel is first. I'm also inclined that way because starting in 54, there's a series of Jewish persecutions against Christians. They start getting expelled from synagogues. Like formally expelled from synagogues. And in the early 50s, that's ramping up. And so I think what's happening with Matthew's gospel is he's watching the Jewish world turn. And the Orthodox Jewish communities, keeping to the Mosaic material, are starting to press Christians to either leave synagogues or stop talking about this Messiah, this Jesus, in the early 50s. And I think that, in large part, is Matthew's catalyst for his gospel. Yeah? Which gets us to purpose then. We've already established like basics, right? Tell the gospel, tell the story of Jesus, proclaim the gospel. And so those we have to put up here. Me and the spelling today. Okay, so those are the first two pieces for this purpose. This is why he writes the gospel. Okay. I think there are a couple of others. And chief among them is this one. Okay. Okay. First, tell the story. Second, proclaim the gospel, the good news. And then last, offer proof that Jesus actually is the Messiah. Primarily by comparison to Moses. Okay. Matthew is going to highlight some distinguishing features for us in the gospel that allow us to see Jesus as that prophet like Moses. Okay? You with me so far? So, for example, this now gets into material in the Gospels. I'm going to be able to do this better just talking to you. So, carry on with your notes as I explain, okay? The structure of the Gospel. Matthew's Gospel works in 5 segments, okay, from a structure standpoint. Those 5 segments are broken up into major discourse. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so here's how it tends to work in Matthew's Gospel. There's 5 major sections of discourse or teaching, right? Speeches. Basically, Jesus starts talking at a certain point in the Gospel, and like it's red letter for the next 3 or 4 pages. Jesus is going to just keep talking, okay? So in Matthew's Gospel, the narratives, the story elements, the action items serve as transitions into the next set of speech or discourse from Jesus. Okay? Which means a couple of things. For Matthew, okay, we may not get the story in chronological order. We'll get the story in a thematic order that moves the story forward, but you may not get the events chronologically because the events in the stories relate then to the discourse that's preceding it. Typically what happens is you start with a speech, and then you get a series of actions that come after it that validate the speech. And then you get another speech, and you get a series of actions that follow it. And you get another speech and a series of actions that follow it. And the last series of actions is the crucifixion and the resurrection. Okay? The 5 discourse sections are as follows. First one is Matthew 5 through 7. These are chapter numbers. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is the first major discourse. And this one is the Sermon on the Mount. And that's where we're going to make our first stop in the Gospel of Matthew tomorrow. Okay? The second starts in 10. Okay? Jesus actually starts talking like 10:5, and it goes to the end of 10. Okay? 3, 13:3 through 53. 4 is 18. He starts talking, I think, in verse 2, 18:2 to the end of 18. And then the last one is yeah, we'll do that one. from 24:4 to the beginning of 26, really goes to the end of 25. Okay? You with me? So here's what Matthew has done. He's broken the gospel into 5 sets of teaching from Jesus. First of them is the Sermon on the Mount. And they break the story up into 5 books, 5 sections. Okay? You with me? Okay. Those 5 sections seem to be designed to parallel the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Messiah, prophet like Moses, you with me? Moses writes the 5 books of the law, the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Jesus has these 5 books within the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew's structured his gospel to be a parallel structure to the Pentateuch that Moses authored. So Jesus' teaching makes 5 books. Moses' teaching makes 5 books. You with me? Okay. It's nuanced things like that that set up what Matthew's doing with this comparison to Moses in the gospel. We're going to look specifically at it in the Sermon on the Mount tomorrow when we get together. Good? Question, concern? Sweet deal. Okay. You have your remaining time to work on your exam.